The Oramics studio is in Kent, in a converted oast house, only some 28 miles or so from Piccadilly Circus. I'm Daphne Oram, the director of the studio, and I'd rather like to introduce you to some of the very varied sort of soundtracks which are produced at my studio.
Daphne Oram was an enigma. She was a British pioneer of electronic music. From 1959 to her death in 2003, she worked alone, quietly developing a sound world which is now so commonplace we hardly even notice it. She set up one of the first electronic music studios in Britain, where she developed a remarkable instrument that predated the synthesizer by a decade. And just before that, she co-founded the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, the organisation that first brought electronic music into our homes.
We have also sound houses, where we practice and demonstrate all sounds and their generation. We have harmonies which you have not, of quarter sounds and lesser slides of sounds. Diverse instruments of music, likewise to you unknown, some sweeter than any you have. We have certain helps which, set to the ear, do further the hearing greatly. We have also diverse strange and artificial echoes, reflecting the voice many times, and as it were tossing it, and some that give back the voice louder than it came, some shriller and some deeper, yea, some rendering the voice differing in the letters or articulate sound from that they receive. We have also means to convey sounds in trunks and pipes, in strange lines and distances.
That astonishing text was written in 1624 by the philosopher Francis Bacon in his book New Atlantis, and in many ways it informed Daphne Oram's approach to making music. She pinned it to the wall of the Radiophonic Workshop in 1958, and it was always on display in her own studio. Daphne was born in 1925 when Britain was between two world wars. Communications and broadcasting technology was in its infancy, and the BBC was a fledgling institution. She had a bright and inquiring mind. When she was only 7 years old, she dreamt up the idea that sound might be generated through a process of drawing lines and patterns. She was creative and scientific. She studied music and electronics. In 1942, Daphne joined the BBC. During the Second World War, when male technicians were away fighting, she developed a career as a balancing engineer. Tape didn't appear until the 1950s, and when it did, Daphne was quick to realise its potential, not just for documentation, but for composition. The tape recorder enabled sound, those strange ethereal movements of air, to be transformed into a tactile medium, tape. Now, sound could be captured, edited, cut, spliced, looped, reversed, slowed down and speeded up. Daphne was able to make the imaginary world of Francis Bacon's sound house a reality. In the early stages of her career, Daphne went to the BBC Research Department in London's Nightingale Square, asking one of the senior engineers if they could spare some equipment and technical guidance towards the music she was imagining.
He reduced me to a very small height and finished by saying, "Miss Oram, the BBC employs 100 musicians to make all the sounds they require, thank you." I went into Broadcasting House late at night and collected from the listening rooms of all the studios around all the photographs I could and started. And I worked until I believe I looked rather grey.
The BBC were keen to demonstrate to all kinds of artists what could be achieved with the new recording technology. In 1957, they hosted a concert of experimental music for those working creatively in all departments, which included music by Stockhausen, Berio and Moderna.
Round and round like a wind from the ground.
Still what of me?
In the same year, the first radiophonic play, Private Dreams and Public Nightmares, was broadcast on the third programme. This generated a great deal of interest from playwrights, producers and directors of the time.
This programme is an experiment. We think it's worth broadcasting as a perfectly serious first attempt to find out whether we can convey a new kind of emotional and intellectual experience by means of what we call radiophonic effects.
Beneath the blanket of your sleep, in the back of the brain, now and always here. and spreads like water.
We didn't have much equipment. We were mostly using a sort of a 3 tape recorder technique and 1 oscillator. I remember we had 1 filter. Great day when the filter arrived. Then they got to know about it, the various departments, and they all rushed at us. And we had so much work. I got a letter that I sent to my mother saying, I can't write any more letters because there's so much work coming in. Everyone's learnt about it.
BBC Press Service, 22nd of May, 1958. The BBC has set up a radiophonic workshop at Maida Vale in London, the first installation of its kind in this country to deal exclusively with the production of radiophonic effects. Thus the BBC is now equipped to provide an aid to productions which neither music nor conventional sound effects can give.
Maddalena Fagandini and Dick Mills worked in the workshop from the late 1950s.
If I told you it had 2 very large recording machines that were actually manufactured by a Swiss motorcycle company, you might begin to get the flavour of this isn't a standard recording studio, because all we had was what we could beg, borrow or steal from redundant equipment. There were no specially designed equipment for making anything, never mind electronic music. We couldn't even think of stereo, a 2-track machine. We were thankful for what we got.
You could start with producing a sound in the studio itself, and then you would record that, and if it sounded reasonable, you would loop it, filtering it. You could try a bit of feedback with it. You could turn it back to front. You could speed it up. Of course, it took ages, and that's the problem.
Brian Hodgson joined the Radiophonic Workshop in 1962 and eventually became its director.
Nobody ever at that point called it music for radio and television. It was mostly, I would say, background atmosphere and also a production studio. I'd been trained as an actor, and it was like an extension of the acting thing. It was a theatre of sound.
I realised that the drama department was a bit concerned about us. We had a visit from certain members of the symphony orchestra, you know. We were creating sounds, whereas they were playing instruments, you know, and they weren't being employed to do these things.
So they felt a threat from the workshop?
They did.
Whereas the people on the continent were exploring and researching, composing for its own sake. We never sprung into action unless anybody else had a vehicle for us to get onto, as it were. One of Daphne's creations was a thing called the ocean. About 3 people marooned on a raft in the ocean after a shipwreck. And the opening of it was just open seawater, which was achieved with a washing up bowl and just paddling the old hat, rippling noises. I don't think she went into elaborate things, but she had the knack of getting things down to its absolute simplicity. You want loneliness and an empty ocean, here's a washing up bowl and a clarinet, you know, get on with it.
Nearly dawn. Nearly day. Clear sky. Silent water. Sky. Water.
Anybody hear me?
We were making sounds which children heard at nursery school. We were making sounds from magic carpets and travels through space. And an awful lot of composers since then have said, it was my first experience of this sound. They became fascinated. So I suppose we provided a route for people to start to become familiar with electronic sound and to become interested and fascinated by them.
Stockhausen came over fairly regularly to work with the symphony orchestra, and that was only across the corridor, look through the window, and you could see all the world's famous musicians in there. Stravinsky was in there. We met Bing Crosby going out through the entrance hall one day. Muhammad Ali strolled down the... I mean, people came to Maida Vale for whatever reason, and a lot of composers came to the workshop because the workshop was on the BBC's tourist trail.
Although she thought of herself as a composer of concert music, Daphne Oram was a highly skilled composer of music for theatre and radio drama. In 1958, she composed the score for Amphitryon 38, the first play to incorporate radiophonic music. Maddalena Fagandini.
The focus was on drama rather than music. They were probably trying to keep the music department at bay, quite likely. So we could not develop the way the place should have done. I mean, if we'd had somebody, the equivalent of Berio or Gerard, around, that would have changed. I would never have left.
Only 10 months after the creation of the Radiophonic Workshop, Daphne Oram resigned from the BBC.
The BBC, in its infinite wisdom, even back in those days in the 50s, seemed to have a thing about health and safety. And they thought that anybody that was exposed to experimentation with weird sounds and things like that shouldn't work more than 6 months at the workshop. Now, Daphne, this was her life's ambition. She'd got up to this pinnacle of creativity, not only in programme making, but in development of a department, and said, well, I'm sorry, but if you insist that I can't work here, then I shall have to consider my position.
Daphne had ideas in her head. She wanted to write music which would stand alone for a start. This vision of a device which would allow her to realise her ideas.
I've travelled into deepest rural Kent on a gloriously sunny day to find the house where Daphne Oram lived, and right now I'm stood in the circular space in Tower Folly, the space that was her studio. And with me is the current owner of the building, Ron. Was there anything of Daphne's here when you moved in?
Well, there was tape recorders, tape recordings, equipment, various equipment, very many books.
What kind of books were there?
Strange books. There was one particular one on the sun and sunspots, time travel, books on plant intelligence and so forth. The house was completely hardwired all around. There was leads leading here, there and everywhere. There's a giant steel water tank underneath the forecourt, and that had been wired for a reverb uses, I believe. The house is enormous. It's in 3 separate parts. So she'd retreated into the smallest part of the house, which is the coach house where the stables were, yeah.
In 1962, we had a trip down to the Oast House, and I always remember the most delicious vegetable soup I've ever tasted in my life. And she'd make great pots of it, and we had that with freshly baked bread and some cheese from her goats, which were in the paddock outside. She was an amazing woman, terribly British, terribly prim and proper, very beautifully spoken. She was always very smart in that very well-tailored British lady, sort of country lady way.
Dick Mills.
She was great fun. We felt very much at home at Daphne's place at that time because her equipment was as much of a... I mustn't say Heath Robinson, but I have... put together as we did at the workshop. Somebody described it as a cross between a Meccano set and a chip shop. The thing we all remember is the concave circular floors in the Oast House, which meant if you dropped anything, you just walked to the middle and picked it up because that's where it rolled to.
Tracy Ross, who works as a BBC studio manager today, was taught by Daphne at Christ Church College, Canterbury in the early 80s. She occasionally visited the Oast House at weekends.
I remember goats in the garden, cats everywhere. You know, we'd make a cup of tea, but there was nowhere to put the teacup down because there'd be a cat or a piece of paper. I remember water through the roof in places and her mending everything herself. I remember being quite anxious about her climbing up ladders, and I remember her running around after the goat, trying to tether it really late at night in the dark. I remember opening the fridge and thinking, I wonder what we might eat tonight.
There was not much in the fridge?
No. It wasn't.
Martin Cook, a mechanical engineer, met Daphne in the 1950s and later helped her with the development of the Oramics machine. He remembers the kind of music she was obliged to compose to keep the studio afloat.
You're always watching for the adverts on the telly because she did quite a few. The one that springs to mind is Nestea, which was powdered tea. But I suppose it earned her some money, so she did the soundtrack for it, and I can remember that. I think that was done from her going pop, and then from that she took it and developed it into this soundtrack, and it was quite modern.
BBC studio manager Joe Hutton has written extensively about Daphne Oram's life and work.
She had started up an independent studio, of which there were hardly any, and she was working in a medium that was pretty unfamiliar to most people. So I imagine she was taking work wherever it came. So she's got a whole library of fairly wacky commercial ads, particularly the Lego Builds It one, which is quite hilarious.
It's Mission Moon for Studs Lego. He's off to pioneer the empty spaces of the moon with Lego, his wonderful building bricks. Build bridge.
Lego builds it.
Build moon tractor.
Lego builds it.
Build missile defense center.
Lego builds it.
So by the end of the 1950s, Daphne Oram had cut her ties with the BBC and set up her own electronic music studio, which was funded through the composition of music for film, advertising and the concert hall. She was working alone, entirely independently, developing technically and aesthetically without support from anywhere. While she was aware of activities in European and American studios, she had no connection with them. Her career took a leap forward when she was commissioned to write music for the 1961 film The Innocents, directed by Jack Clayton and starring Deborah Kerr.
It's the Turn of the Screw story, Henry James's story. It was very ghostly, very frightening to do, and I actually pulled the curtains before I started because I got so frightened about making these ghosts sort of sounds. And there I used electronic sounds and what I call music concrete sounds, with some of my own voice in it, all sorts of things mixed together. This was in the early 60s, and this was an exciting time because we could combine all these things. I think our sort of sound can do things that an orchestra really can't do. I think it's somewhere between sound effect and a musical sound. And in The Innocents, I was trying to get this feeling that there might be a ghost there. Now, Henry James doesn't define it. He doesn't really say there is an actual ghost. It may be that it's all in the imagination. And so I had this sound, I think people will remember it if they've ever seen the film, that just creeps in now and then and suggests it may be there in the room or it might not be.
Look! No! He's here! For the last time he's here! No, he's dead! He's here and you must say his name!
I've covered most of the techniques there, I think. I have the straightforward oscillators giving various wave shapes like sine waves and square waves. And I also use the concrete type of sound, natural sound picked up from a microphone and then manipulated on the tape recorder using filters, playing sounds at various pitches and editing. I've used music concrete, for example, in this piece called Pulse Persephone. I took sounds from all over the Commonwealth, the sound of a steel drum or a zither from Hong Kong and a flute. And then I just needed one note. I could repitch this and make a composition out of that. I could plan it all beforehand, get just the sort of sounds I wanted. And it's a sort of promenade used at Burlington House when the Treasures from the Commonwealth exhibition was on there.
In the mid-1960s, Daphne Oram turned her attention to the project that would occupy her until the end of her life, the Oramics system, electronic music made by drawing. Simple enough to do today, even on an ordinary domestic computer, but in those days it was only a dream. She managed to secure a Gulbenkian Foundation grant to develop her ideas, and with this funding she was able to employ the services of an electronics engineer, Graham Wrench.
I got a phone call from her and she said, "Graham, I've got a project going on here. We've got so far, now we're totally stuck. Would you care to bring your wife, come and have a meal one evening, and I'd like your thoughts on it." She had this concept of being able to produce sounds which were not acoustically generated by any known means, string or woodwind or anything like that. She wanted to be the artist in charge of the noise. So that meant she needed some sort of manual interface in real time. She said, "Look, Graham, what I'm trying to do," she said, "I want to sit at this machine and draw my music on it."
In 1972, Daphne Oram published a book entitled An Individual Note of Music, Sound and Electronics, in which she outlines her ideas about the relationships between these three phenomena. It's considerably ahead of its time. In one chapter, for example, she muses on the notion of memory and data storage, anticipating the desktop computer by at least a decade. At this time, she was also collaborating with the composer Thea Musgrave, and they worked together on a number of pieces for instruments and electronics, including From One to Another, Soliloquy, and Beauty and the Beast. In 1972, the same year as the publication of the book, they made a programme for Radio 3.
I have a new technique completely, one that I've evolved over the years, and it's still evolving, it's got a long way to go yet, which I call Oramics. And that is using graphic representation of sound.
I've seen your machine, Oramics, and I've been very impressed by its potential. I must say potential because, of course, it's not yet fully developed. I suppose you can only call it a prototype.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain simply what it does, how it's different from synthesizers and other equipment?
I'm interested in being able to manipulate sound to give every subtle nuance that I want. There seems to be no real notation system in electronic music. I wanted a system where I could graphically represent what I wanted and give that representation, that musical score in fact, to a machine and have from it the sound. I'm finding that what one has to do is to pick out each parameter separately. You want to be able to give a graph for how loud it is at that particular moment, how the vibrato is giving a wavering to the pitch. And so I have a number of film tracks going by, and on these I draw the graphs. For the pitch I put what we call digital information. That is, I can put a dot rather like a crotchet or quaver. I've been thinking about this for years, actually. I believe my father said that when I was 7 years old I was predicting that one day I would have a marvellous machine that would make any sound I wanted.
Did her ideas add up? Did they make sense to you?
Yes, they did. She was a good musician in her own right. Therefore, she understood timbre, she understood attack and decay and the dynamics of a note. And she had a very good ear, obviously, because she wouldn't have been a classical music balancer without. Let's face it, you balanced a complete symphony orchestra with 2 or 3 microphones in those days. From the technology point of view, I'm afraid I was on my own.
From the electronics point of view?
Yes. I built everything myself, basically.
Martin Cook.
Some pop people who came down to see her, who she didn't seem too impressed with at the time because she was so unaware. From what she told me, 2 guys from Liverpool and 1 from Dartford, which we did use, were either Lennon McCartney or one that's 2 of the Beatles, and possibly a Mick Jagger. We're not sure, but it sounds pretty much like that because people were getting interested in alternative sorts of music, methods of producing music, and of course Daphne was up there right at the front, but I don't think she had a clue who they were and what their impact was going to be.
In the 1960s, Daphne was influencing pop musicians, and she continues to do so today. I met up with Myra Calix, who records on the Warp record label, and asked her if Daphne Oram's work and that of the Radiophonic Workshop was still an inspiration.
I think it is, and I think probably for lots of people, it was the first time they heard really crazy sound. Well, you know, they heard it on TV or the radio, and that influenced what they thought was normal or acceptable or what they were interested in. And they would never have heard those kind of sounds. I mean, the obvious, most famous one is the Doctor Who soundtrack, but there's so much around that they did. If you were 12 and living in Yorkshire, that's the only place you would have heard things like that. The real concentration and obvious focus on those sounds, using very simple composition, but actually using sounds that you've really laboured over and really worked on.
Joe Hutton.
We'd been listening to Stockhausen and Berio, and there's something in Daphne's music that is much more lyrical in a way and sensitive, I think. It was much less harsh than those sort of European blocks of sound, and this was something much more composed and delicately structured in a way. It seems to be knitted together in a much more flowing manner somehow.
I try to stop myself doing too much before I've got this equipment as I want it. But I have had a piece played in the Queen Elizabeth Hall and the Purcell Room in Edinburgh, and a ballet that went around the world, really. All of that was drawn sound, and yes. That was very early days.
Joe Hutton described this ballet music, Bird of Parallax.
It's a very strident piece. There's two sections in it. One's called Hell Ride and one's called Donkey Ride. There's this kind of crazy, sort of lolloping, donkey-ish rhythm going on. And it goes into another section where there's sustained ringing tones that she was very good at. And this is in all her music actually, where she plays on the decay part of the sound. And this is something which is very Daphne Oram-esque. And because of the Oramics, she was able to slide the pitch of tones in a very kind of fine nuances.
To go outside the comfort of the BBC, where your programme creativity needs were provided for you, I mean, not only did she have to self-support, but she would have to try and find outlets for her creativity. Then I turn around and think, God, with that equipment, how would I go about doing a 90-minute film score? I should think she found it extremely frustrating, but then if you're immersed in an ongoing research, you become less aware of outside things. All the time you're trying to find out, the next step.
I think it was a cumbersome way of making music. Technically interesting, scientifically novel.
She got involved in dealing with schools and programs to teach the children or give the children the opportunity to experience the electronic music and music itself. She was so devoted, intense and devoted about the potential use of sound, and she was so sure that there could be a better use for sound, and sound had a lot more to offer. That was Daphne's whole premise.
She was driven, which you get from her book, to teaching. She has a teacher's mind, and she has that ability, I guess, which comes from very detailed knowledge of your subject, of breaking it down into kind of understandable steps.
Adwick High School, 19th of January 1968. This is a piece composed by Denise McDermott. I have called this surprise piece because of the symbol coming in suddenly and surprising everybody.
She didn't want to impose what she'd done in the past in what perhaps she was going to kind of work on with students and that sort of thing. She wanted each person to find their own way.
In 1960, Daphne composed one of her most well-known pieces, Four Aspects. I asked Myra Calix what, for her, made the piece unique.
I think it's the violence. You know, behind her perfect demeanour of the twin set in pearls, there is this violence, sonic violence, which I really love, especially when you're performing something, because there's something in getting rid of all that. There's aggression in that piece, which is lovely.
There's something very complete about Daphne, which I've yet to come across a composer that I think has covered all her bases so completely, insofar as being an engineer, a very accomplished engineer, somebody who's designed and built her own recording medium, somebody who really, she took on the whole of the BBC, which is not something that many people do lightly. She was fairly fearlessly battering the people that she could get in touch with to start some kind of electronic music studio.
How did Daphne move on from the Oramics machine?
Well, I think by the late 70s, maybe going into the 80s, she had decided, with the advent of the microprocessor, she decided that that was the way forward for her. She got a grant from the Vaughan Williams Trust to develop Oramics for computers.
She was probably going through quite a frustrating time in that she'd gone quite a long way with the analogue system, obviously. And then she had to backtrack in order to get the digital system up and running. You know, there's a lot she had to learn about programming the computer.
If we can get this computer to shape the sound, of inflecting it, that's what I'm working on now. I've really dismantled my studio because it was getting very old. The equipment had been everywhere, up and down the country. So I dismantled that and brought myself one of the latest computers. You know, I have to write in machine code because it's got to be very fast. A whole lot of things have got to happen very, very quickly. You write this stuff, you know, with almost a cold towel around your forehead because it's so difficult to think it. And you write away all night and then you turn on and just one note comes out. But if that note is a sort of, you know, instead of bang, that makes my day, my night as well.
I'm here at Goldsmiths College in South East London, where the Daphne Oram archive is being lovingly catalogued and digitised. And Mick Grierson, research fellow, has taken us into the electronic music studios.
What we've got is a modern version of what we think, from looking at various documents we found in the archive, that Daphne was trying to do with her Oramics system. Essentially, it's a series of digital controls for controlling a pitch of a device, a synthesizer, and then some areas on the screen where you can draw to control the volume and the texture of the sound and the vibrato amounts.
So what are your plans for this? Is this a pilot?
We've got this system, we're trying to develop it, and what we're going to do is make it available for free so that anyone can download it and use it and make Daphne Oram's music, which, from looking at the work that we've seen of hers and reading what she wanted to do, that's pretty much her goal. So we're sort of trying to finish what she started.
While Mick and I were playing with his up-to-date prototype of the Oramics machine, we were joined by composer Vicky Bennett, who began drawing on the screen.
Okay, well, in the pitch box, I've drawn a lot of horizontal lines with gaps between them, 2 or 3 different layers on top of one another. So in theory, it would be playing 3 different pitches at the same time. And then in the box below that, I've done a kind of wave of upwards volume 3 times, and then a vibrato that sort of does a little bit of a curly bit, so it's kind of woo woo like that. I should imagine that if you were sitting here for a long time, you'd know exactly how to make certain patterns, much the same way as if you knew how to use like a Korg MS-20, you'd know how to patch things right to get a desired effect. Here it comes. You would need to sit with this for quite some time, and then you develop a relationship with it as an instrument. And so it's an instrument. You don't work with your hands in the same way because it's on a screen. So it's a mental way of working.
In the 80s, although successfully developing the Oramics system on computer, Daphne was finding funding very hard to come by. Brian Hodgson.
I think probably Daphne went through some very bad times after the initial success of the Oramics and the initial grants she got. I think things came to a little head when Desmond Briscoe wrote the Radiophonic Workshop the first 25 years, and Daphne felt very much that she'd been overlooked in that, and that her contribution to the Radiophonic Workshop had been played down. And I know there was a certain amount of bitterness and frustration that she hadn't been credited more.
Any money that she did have, she wanted for her research. And she was quite prepared to live a frugal life for that.
Daphne actually would just about survive towards the end. There wasn't the money available. I don't think anybody had sufficient imagination, apart from those very early Gulbenkian grants she got, to back her. Because she was also an unlikely person. I mean, this prim, almost Miss Marple character. If Miss Marple walked into the bank and said, I want some money to develop this fantastic machine, she would not have got it. But it was there, and this was this amazing machine that, if the resources had been available, would have completely changed the progress of electronic music in this country.
She was a woman who wasn't particularly interested in being restricted by what was possible. I mean, that was really apparent. You get that from her book, and you get that from knowing about her life. You know, she wasn't going to sit down in the BBC and let the rest of Europe be developing these music studios, electronic music studios. She wanted it for herself. So I don't think whether or not something was possible wasn't part of Daphne's makeup.
I've come to the Purcell Room at the South Bank Centre to a celebration of Daphne Oram's life and work, and I'm joined by Phil Hallett, who's a research assistant at the Daphne Oram Archive and is the organiser of today's event. Phil, what's happening today?
Today we've got a whole range of events around Daphne's work which celebrate the launch of the Daphne Oram collection at Goldsmiths College.
You've been responsible for the archive at Goldsmiths. What's been discovered? What kinds of things are there in there?
The kinds of things in there range from photographs from Daphne's childhood right through her life to photographs of her presenting at the Edinburgh Festival. Huge amounts of press cuttings, which, especially in the early 60s, there was a great amount of press around Daphne's work, which was really innovative and exciting at the time, and many of the broadsheets picked up on it, and lots of articles about her in the papers. Daily logs. There are daily logs of machine code, for example, which are interspersed occasionally with these beautiful little moments where she'll make a note and say, it's a beautiful April day today, and myself and the cat are sitting outside in the sunshine. And then it will go on to pages and pages of just this pure machine code where she's trying to develop her technique and her skills. When we first looked We thought that there were about 200 reel-to-reel quarter-inch tapes from the 60s right through to the late 80s, but in fact there were nearer to 700.
So in the concert tonight we have a huge range of electronic music, an audience of aficionados from the London electroacoustic scene, the British electroacoustic scene, and we have this piece by the British composer Thea Musgrave.
Yes. Thea composed a piece in collaboration with Daphne. It's a piece for solo viola and tape, for which Daphne composed the electronic tape part. It was composed in 1970 and it's called From One to Another.
So after all these years, has Daphne Oram's vision and sound world become the norm? Is it now mainstream? Myra Calix.
The music that she pioneered, or this idea of using sound as such a focus of music, the actual individual sounds being the most important thing, that kind of thing has become acceptable and mainstream in things like car adverts and advertising. People want to get your attention. They use strange sounds. Whether it's real pop music, the sort of Britneys or the Kylies, there are always weird sounds in there. And so in that sense, it is acceptable and it's mainstream. But on its own, just the Daphne Oram piece is not mainstream. There is a fine line as to what people will accept. They will accept a load of weirdness if you hand it to them with a spoonful of sugar.
She had the mix in her of extraordinary practicality and capability, but also the most broad sort of creative aura.
It's this idea of history, innovation, because obviously she did more than just make music. She made a machine to make music. People are looking back and going, look, actually there were women innovating and making music and making electronic music and making great strides at that time. So the legacy is almost one of a pioneer. She's left us with amazing music, but it's more than that. She's left us with an icon.
She was fearless in her desire to realise her imagination.
She lived through her work, what she left for others to hear as her personality and a distillation of all of her thoughts on life.
Daphne, in fact, was ahead of her time. She actually developed a computer synthesizer long before we even knew the term computer. One of the great unlauded pioneers.
If you think of going from Purcell's day to Berlioz's Fantastic Symphony, you think of the change of sound. And then go from the Fantastic Symphony to our own day, and that's about the same leap in years. And the orchestra has not evolved very much, do it? And this is where I feel that we must look at new sound. We must see that we cannot go on speaking the same language, and that we must evolve, or we become dead.